topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Hi, welcome to Learning to Dance in the Rain. I am Shelby Wagner, your host, and this is the space where we dive deep into the life's toughest challenges, providing insights and guidance and meaningful conversations to help you navigate through whatever storms that you may face. Today, I'm very excited to welcome an author, Bill Yarborough. And have you ever watched a movie or read a book about mind control? I just read a book a couple of months ago about this woman who had two personalities and so on. And I thought, well, that was rather scary. And then I met Bill Yarborough. Bill, come on out here and let's talk about your story. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Shelby. Thank you.
How are you today?
Doing good. Delighted to be here.
Very good. So would you like to share with us your journey to discovery? Or
sure.
What started all this story that you have to tell?
Okay. First, just a brief introduction about myself. I was actually, when I worked, I was both in the public accounting profession and worked for a large financial institution and was president of two nonprofits, board president. It's kind of a volunteer thing. But I did some writing while I was doing that. Actually, I did some short story writing and such, but it was kind of really a hobby. But when I retired, I got a lot more serious, had a lot more time. And a lot of people had been urging me to write about a certain experience in my life. Basically, there was the CIA operated a mind control program in the 1950s and early 60s called MK Ultra. And some of you may have heard about it. Some of you may not have. Basically, they experimented on adults, college students, university students, and children. And actually, my sister and my brother and I were children in that program during the summer of 1958. The memories were repressed for 30 years, but then in our 30s, in my brother's case, late 20s, the memories began to come back. And they've been coming back for a number of years. And so some of you may want to know what MK Ultra is, more about it, exactly what they did. Basically, they used electric shock, psychedelic drugs, hypnosis, psychological assault, and isolation and other forms of exploitation to sort of put the mind into a state of shock. And once the mind was in that state of shock, the feeling was they could reprogram it and whatever they wanted. They had 149 different sub-projects, but the broad aims included basically how to master mind control was one of them. Number two, to develop better interrogation techniques if they captured enemy agents. And three, to prevent American agents from divulging secrets if they were captured. So that's sort of the broad outline of the program. It was actually farmed out to 150 different institutions, including universities and colleges, prisons, hospitals, private individuals, pharmaceutical companies. It was really widespread, and it And so it was basically, a super secret. MK was sort of a code designation for certain projects in the CIA. And ultra meant it was super secrets, ultra secret. So very few people knew about it until it was exposed in 1973. I might pause there, Shelby, if you have a question before I go on.
Well, I think you're doing very well there.
Okay, we can just continue.
Okay.
So now a lot of people may think that this was just kind of an obscure project that didn't really have much historical significance, but it actually had a pretty big influence on events to come. Probably one of the most surprising ones, and the one that really surprised me. I actually did research. Actually, our memories began to surface when, like I said, in our 30s, and we really had no idea what this really was. I mean, the things that came up was that we were locked up in jail cells. We remembered we got the electric shock. My sister was pretty certain she was exposed to drugs. She was 8, I was 4, my brother was 2. And so psychedelics was definitely a big part of it. And actually, MK Ultra CIA owned pretty much all the LSD in the country back in the late 50s, early 60s. And they were also very interested in developing other psychedelics, such as they heard about the magic mushrooms in Mexico that the shamans were using in sacred ceremonies. So they sent an agent down there along with an individual who had an American who had participated in one of those ceremonies. He was really the first outsider to participate. And they wanted to get the magic mushrooms. So they did. We brought it back to the United States. And MK Ultra, which was composed of a lot of chemists, created psilocybin from it. So they took LSD, psilocybin, and other drugs and disseminated them throughout the universities of the United States and colleges, encouraging the students, or actually encouraging the professors to disseminate them to the students to use them. And so there's, when I did my research on MK Ultra, there's 2 very good books that I found. We had remembered, again, we had remembered the stuff, didn't know what it was. Until my brother-in-law called me up one day and he said he heard a radio interview, kind of like this one, where a lady who had investigated adults who had been children in this MK Ultra program and began to share what went on. And he says, it's exactly what you and his wife and sister and your brother have been talking about. So we began to look into that, and sure enough, the jail cells, the electric shock, the drugs, it was all present. But so once I heard about it, I really began to do research. And there's been a lot that has come out about it over the years, starting in 1973 when the program was exposed for the first time. I'll get back to that in a little while. The 2 best books was The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks, and he basically explained that their doing that pretty much created the drug revolution of the 1960s and the counterculture movement. Another very good book was called The Poisoner Chief by Steve Kinzer, and that book was actually published in 2019. It was really the most comprehensive book I've come across, and it explained a lot. Like there was one individual in this program who was very brutal, no empathy whatsoever. And I learned when I read that book that they actually recruited Nazis from the when the war was over. The United States created a program called Operation Paperclip, where the War Crimes Branch was interviewing Nazis of all stripes, but they particularly went into the concentration camps and interviewed these individuals to find out what they were doing. And so Operation Paperclip to determine if they should be charged with crimes against humanity. So what Operation Paperclip did is that if they thought these people contained an expertise that would be useful in the Cold War, they would go ahead and put a paperclip on the file. And so those Hitler had mind control activities at Dachau. And so, and this kind of leads into how my sister and I believe, and my brother believe, we ended up in MK Ultra. My father was on the war crimes branch staff at Dachau. He was in the American military after the war. He decided to stay on. He was a lawyer, stay on and work for the war crimes branch. And so we suspect, that somehow got him swept into that. And then we lived in Maryland when we were young. And Fort Detrick, at that time, Camp Detrick, was basically the MK Ultra headquarters. So we lived in the area. My father would have been exposed to these people. And that's how we think we got brought into it. I did confront my father over it. And he basically, it was a very strange conversation. Initially, he denied it. And then suddenly his voice changed. And he began looking over his shoulders and whispering, and then began to defend those people with very different gestures and manners from what I was accustomed to. And then his normal self would return, and he said, I don't know anything about this. And then he would start looking over his shoulders again as if he was trying to keep the secret from somebody. No one else was in the house. It was just he and I at that time. And so split personality came to mind, and I learned, from these books that I read, that was, as I mentioned at the beginning, that was one of the broad aims, was to make sure American agents who were captured did not divulge secrets. And, several of the books I read explained they did that by trying to create sub-personalities that knew the mission, so that if they were captured, their primary personality would not have anything to divulge. And I don't know if it really worked that well, since when I brought it up, he began to talk about it. And that's actually what Stephen Kensner, concluded, is that they began to realize a lot of this stuff really actually wasn't working that well, and they eventually began to wind it down.
How did you start? How did the memory start? Did you have dreams about these things? Or
sure.
Yes?
Well, yeah, no, that's a very good question. And you actually picked on one thing right off the bat. It actually remembered in various ways. I'll get to the dream in a minute. I mean, my first dim inkling occurred when my brother, unfortunately, had a psychotic episode. He was the youngest and much more vulnerable. And so it really prevented him from having a much more effective life. So when he was 23, he became psychotic, and he began to make what I thought were very bizarre statements, and suggested I read stuff that I didn't understand why he wanted me to read it. And so, my memories had not broken loose yet. And I think his broke loose, but so fast and so overwhelming that it just disintegrated his psyche. But I began to have a memory of staying at this big, terrifying house as a kid. And I would think that I never was at a place like that. So I dismissed it. I just assumed it was part of his thing. But then about 6 years later, I was visiting my sister, and we had an intensive meeting with her therapist. She actually had a therapist. She thought things weren't quite right about our childhood, but she couldn't quite articulate it. So I was brought in. I was visiting her in New York and City, and we had actually in Connecticut, and we had a fairly in-depth conversation with her therapist. And I felt really weird when we left that meeting, and so did she. And that night, she literally had a vision. You said dream, but it came to her as a vision. And she was told that she viewed it as a vision from God, and she was told that you and your brothers have repressed part of your young childhood and that you must remember it. And she just grew increasingly terrified and then couldn't do it. And the vision said, that's fine. All you have to do is wake your brother and he will begin to remember. And so she did. And I began to remember things as soon as she said it, although it wasn't necessarily initially about MK Ultra. And I don't want to give away the whole book. So some things, I won't get into, but the first memory blocks were very significant, but they weren't necessarily about MK Ultra. But it started the pattern where my sister and I began to, visualize it clearly in your mind. Where were you standing? Where was I standing? What was the lighting like? Who came into the room? And then we began to compare details, and it was very similar. So when the MK Ultra memories broke several years later, interestingly, when my brother first mentioned it, we had established this pattern of how to verify our memories. So other ways they were triggered, once we began to compare notes, it was almost initially like a deluge. And, we would, you could be watching a TV show and it would trigger it because something in it was similar to what happened.
Oh, wow.
I might mention that long before, when I was in college, long before I remembered my past, I watched The Manchurian Candidate, the 1960s black and white Frank Sinatra version, and I completely freaked out. I couldn't sleep, and I liked horror stories. I liked scary stuff, and I couldn't understand why this got to me. That I actually wondered if I had been subject to mind control. I dismissed it. But but movies can, and books and just everyday life can just, like certain words, like there were certain words I could never pronounce, like the word scissor, could never pronounce it.
Oh.
And my sister and I couldn't deal with knives. We were terrified of knives. Well, that had something to do with one of the big memory blocks, with somebody involved in knives. So, and I might spend a little bit more time about my parents in this regard. I think that there were signs that, as I said, that their minds were monkeyed with too. So what's very bizarre is that, we were in this program, we believe, in the summer of 1958 in Maryland. And but once we were out, we were never put back into one of those programs, to our knowledge, the best we can say. And we know that other victims of MK Ultra have been brought back for repeated sessions, which I think is much more damaging. Mm-hmm. Of course, once we began to remember this, we got therapists, and we would have weekly, back in those days, the 1980s, talk therapy, psychotherapy was really, it still is very significant, but some of the more innovative techniques I've used since weren't around then. And, but the talk therapy proved already, as I mentioned, we had that significant vision after a day long, an hour and a half session with my sister's therapist. So several years later, when I moved my brother down to live with me in San Antonio, when I began to remember these memories. And he had a therapist, eventually became my therapist as well. And we had my sister down for what we called a 7-day intensive, because we remembered a number of things, but my therapist was puzzled about some things. So we went through 7 straight days of meeting, an hour and a half. And the most significant memory block of all that had a very profound effect on my life, and it's basically that our therapist said that he was sort of surprised that my sister and I were doing as well as we were, given what we went through. And he says, generally speaking, you have to have a contravening positive influence to survive an ordeal like that. And we were not aware of one at that school. We called it the school. And it was a MK Ultra facility. And but on the way, so he said, you must be super strong individuals. And that didn't feel right. And it didn't feel right with my sister. So that evening, literally, we had a significant memory block, not of something bad, but of the fact that there was a protector there. And it was a very powerful memory. So I mentioned that they were interested in Indian shamanic rituals, the magic mushrooms. Sort of the reasons there's aspects of the metaphysical in my story because they really, the head of MK Ultra, Sidney Gottlieb, who the Poison in Chief book is written about, because he also headed up America's assassin program. You may have heard of the attempts to kill Castro with exploding cigars or exploding oysters. So Sidney Gottlieb ran that program for the U.S. government, but he'd also run MK Ultra. But he really believed that there were, forces in the universe beyond what science knows and understands. So he was really interested in connecting with some of those. He was very much of a mystical person, very complex person. In that book, Poison in Chief, great book about him. I don't use any real people from MK Ultra or the CIA in my novel. And I'll get to why I wrote a novel instead of a memoir in just a moment. But we could kind of understand how they might be interested in this boy. He was raised to be a shaman by his very powerful shamanic grandmother. So, they were, I think, interested in producing those kinds of qualities they gave. They gave us psychedelics. So he would have been, and I'd read elsewhere that they had taken kids from Mexico and South America, as well as the United States and Canada. So, but he tried to protect us the best he could. And he was very advanced in things. So, so literally, I had never thought I would get married. I never thought I'd have a relationship. But the day after I remembered him, within a week, or really literally, actually the next day, I knew I would. Because it was sort of like having a person that was a positive influence kind of unlocked a part of me that could relate to having a relationship. And so that was a very powerful thing and significant. The reason I'm writing it, I wrote it as a novel rather than a memoir, is that, basically I was 4 years old. The memories were repressed for 30 years. They gave us psychedelics. We were subjected to trauma, and you disassociate, with trauma. So that all those things, it made me conclude that I can't be sure about this stuff, and the fact there were some improbable memories mixed in with it that could have been produced by the drugs or other things. So I let the reader make that decision as far as the novel is concerned, what's real and what's not real when it comes to these abnormal type things. But and then also my therapist felt it would be easier to do it as a novel where you had some psychological distance. And she felt that writing it would have a cathartic effect, whereby I'm kind of dealing with things slowly over time, letting them out, as opposed to my brother, who was just overwhelmed when the memories first began to affect him. But, you know, and one other thing I'll mention to you is that I was going back and forth on as to whether or not to write this. A lot of people were urging me to. You know, I had written short stories. I liked writing. I did a lot of writing at work. And I literally went to church one Sunday, and the minister in the sermon, actually, the weekend I was pondering this, said, "You can never fully heal from institutional inflicted abuse unless you make it public." So that kind of pushed me over the line, and I started writing the novel.
That's very interesting. That's what found out with being scammed by, financially by romance scammers. And a lot of people are getting scammed by investments and so on. And a lot of people don't want to talk about it. But we have found that the more you talk about it, the easier it gets. You feel better about it. And so I can go along with that thought there, and that encourage people that when they do have a problem, you do need to talk to somebody that is trustworthy, but someone that you can talk to and get help that
Sure.
way.
Well, that's wonderful that you're doing that, because that stuff is out there. We know people have attempted to scam us, and once we were scammed for not a huge amount of money, but some money. And yeah, the more knowledge is the best way to fight that.
That's right. And I don't know. Well, especially in a romance, like I went on the internet dating after my husband died, and I don't know. You get hypnotized. I mean, here's people paying attention to you, and talking to you and listening to you, and I don't know. They say it's like being hypnotized, and can you say, well, they went further with you with the drugs and that, but I imagine there was some hypnotism in there too, involved with that mind
Yeah,
control.
yeah. A lady in my critique group has written a story about romance. Meeting somebody on a ship where you're supposed to meet people, and then being completely scammed. It's interesting enough. I did meet my wife through a dating service. My sister, literally the day that we remembered the boy from Mexico, the shaman boy, my sister said, "You live a lonely lifestyle." I had a girlfriend. We never got married, but in another city. But I'd moved to San Antonio, and she says, "You need to go join a dating service." And this was before the internet era, just before it. And
Oh yeah.
so, but they still had them back then. And she wrote down the name of the number, of the dating service and the telephone number. And when she handed me that, I said, "Not in 1,000 years," because I was at that place psychologically that I couldn't do it.
Right.
And then after that memory block broke, I did call that number. And speaking of healing, and you mentioned therapist, we might enter that field. Does that make sense? The healing arena. So what I would say to everybody, if you have significant trauma like I did, if you can get a therapist, I think that's very critical. I mean, there's a lot of techniques that can help you, but a therapist is really, they have a lot of skills. And so, I've had 2 great therapists, and 3 now. And so I really strongly recommend that they can bring you to, they get you to talk about it, and sort of help guide you when you do have the memories. You got to be careful, Now, one thing I want to emphasize is, you do not need to have repressed memories, like I talked about, because I think that's, not totally rare, but not the most frequent thing. But it does happen to people. But a lot of people bury their emotions. They may have had a bad experience. They may have had trauma and do know it occurred, but they sort of buried it. They got a memory of it, but they really haven't used either therapist or other techniques to release the emotional wounds. And so, if you've got my book, the novel, Memories of MK Ultra, is really designed to show the power of the unconscious mind,
Right.
how it drives your behavior. So it's broken up into two storylines. One of them is from the perspective of a guy named Dr. Holtzman, which again is fictional, who is running this program. So the reader sees what's being done to these kids. The other storyline is about three siblings, Tommy, Beth, and Curtis Matthews. And it starts just before they go into the program, jumps to just after they get out of the program, and follows them up into their adulthood in their 30s. And so those two storylines are interwoven. So the reader knows what happened to them and why they are kind of twisted in ways, their personality. But they don't. And then you can begin to get an idea of the unconscious mind, how it can drive behavior. But that also applies to unresolved emotional issues that you may be conscious of but haven't dealt with. And the novel eventually gets into how the memory blocks, when they begin to collapse, and how it impacts their lives. But a lot of it, the first part of it is when you have these kind of things, how does it affect your performance in school or your relationships with friends, and then later on in college, and then what kind of career choice you pick. And in all of their cases, this was sort of influenced by MK Ultra. They thought they knew why they were making these decisions, but they did not know that a lot of this was really programmed into them.
Rebel, do you have that picture of his book, The Memories? Yeah, there it is. Memories of MK Ultra, A Journey of Discovery from Darkness to Deliverance. Is this book out now, Bill, already, or is it coming out soon?
It's the way I would put that is imminent. It's the official publication is due very soon. You can actually get it on Kindle already, on Amazon, and you can order the paperback, but they're making a couple of corrections to the paperback, and when I'm notified, when we're notified that those corrections are done, then it'll be officially published. So change the publication date on Amazon, and the marketing campaign will launch, and things like that. So the
series, it's not. Did I read that it's a series? The first of a series?
The first of a series, yeah. First of a series. It's probably going to be a trilogy. And some of the readers that might enjoy reading it, I did have I've had over 100 beta readers read it already. And then I also had a woman's book group of 16 read it. And then I also had a focus group of 11 readers from a professional organization it's no longer around, but it's too bad because it was really great. They had very experienced book readers, 11 in my case, who read an average of 50 books a year, review the book, critique it, all kinds of things, and then I got the feedback. And what I've learned from it is, again, it is a good book club book because it has a lot of different interesting questions that come up. And the book club that read it was called the Wild Book Club, and at the time that they read it, they said it was the longest book discussion they ever had, 3 hours.
Oh, wow.
So, but what I'm calling it is a coming of age psychological thriller with aspects of the historical and metaphysical. And MK Ultra itself is a dark chapter in American history, but the story includes the historical backdrop of those eras. The 60s, we talked about the counterculture movement, but the 60s and 70s were very turbulent times. A lot of people kind of forget 1,500 bombings on the campuses. In 1970, most major universities and colleges had to shut down because they literally lost control of them. Civil rights violence over that. A lot of cities burnt. There was not to mention the counterculture movement itself. And my book captures that because the older sister gets swept up in that. She was put in the psychedelic program as a kid, but when the counterculture movement and the drug revolution begins, the character Beth just is swept away, and that's very, very traumatic on the family. My mother did grow up in Nazi Germany. My father met her there, and this, I don't think this has anything to do with why we were in MK Ultra, but I mentioned Operation Paperclip. The most famous member of Operation Paperclip is Werner von Braun, who some of you may know was Hitler's chief rocket engineer for the V-2 rockets they sent to London. The United States, one of the reasons why it was going after these Nazis after World War II was because the Russians and the Chinese wanted them also. So it was sort of a race to see who could get them. And so Werner von Braun, basically took over America's rocket program. He, basically designed the rockets up to the Saturn V rocket that got us to the moon. But his mother was, interestingly, my mother's godmother. And my mother, having grown up in Nazi Germany, experienced a lot of. She was in Dresden at the bombing of Dresden, if you've heard of that. Very high civilian casualties. So those are the kind of historical type things that are in the novel as well, and also the metaphysical. I already alluded to. But a lot of people that are interested in history, that are interested in that era, they find that very interesting. Of course, the CIA, that's a lot of people are fascinated in MK Ultra itself.
What was the hardest part about writing this book for you?
My brother's psychotic breakdown.
Okay.
He was the person I was very close to my sister, but she was older and she left when we were, in junior high. And he was the person I guess I was closest to, and to see, and he had a great personality, and just to see that disintegrate, was very difficult.
Is he still alive? Or?
No, he passed away. Yeah, he, a lot of people in his condition smoke a lot. So I think it really weakened his lungs. He interestingly enough, he would, up until we confronted him with the very first memory, my sister and I, that we recalled, he had to be institutionalized on a regular basis. And after and it wasn't MK Ultra, but after we confronted him on the very first significant memory block, he never had to again. It stopped. But he just could never become really functional. So he stayed at.
Two is really quite young to
Exactly.
be put. When even 4, I would think would be a very young age to be put through something like that.
Yes, yeah, I think if I hadn't had the protector, it would have been devastating. The other thing is we weren't in it as long. I mean, I met a man whose father was in it, and he was subjected to electric shock and psychedelic drugs on a pretty much nonstop basis for several months. And
do you think that this story would be a good film?
Well, I got several folks in that industry already contacting me, so we'll see.
Well, I've had some too, so I don't know whether that'll ever come.
Well, I mean, it's tough to get things green lighted, but there's also TV. So, a lot of people think it would lend itself more to TV because of the
Right.
series nature.
Is there a particular question that you wish people would ask you about your writing or your story?
Sure.
Something.
No, that's a good thing. I know some people may have a hard time believing that it's true. And I've had people, when I share it with them, they say, well, that sounds like something from the darkest regions of the internet.
Mm.
And then I asked them to go to my website, billyarbo.com, go to the novel page. There you will see on that page the articles written by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, BBC. I've seen it in the Wall Street Journal. Endless articles by the major media about mind control and the MK Ultra program. Not to mention those books that I mentioned, Poisoner in Chief and Search for the Manchurian Candidate. They were very well reviewed by those types of publications as well. It broke in 1973. What happened is that the New York Times began to uncover illegal CIA activities. For example, bugging people within the United States that were involved with the counterculture movement. They obviously regretted they created that. And so that was exposed. The Senate decided to investigate those activities because they learned that they had overthrown governments in South America. And then what happened is Richard Helms, that's the only historical figure I mentioned here, was the CIA director at that time. He had actually been involved with MK Ultra, was key to start it. So he ordered all of the MK Ultra records destroyed before the Senate could subpoena them. And most of them were destroyed, but some did survive. And then President Ford, when this really exploded, he created the Rockefeller Commission, headed up by the Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller. So they investigated it. And then, as I mentioned, that book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, he actually used the Freedom of Information Act to get all these documents. And then he interviewed a lot of the people that were involved. So, some people call it a conspiracy theory. Well, it was a conspiracy because it was kept very secret, but it was no theory. It was a historical fact. And it surprises people when they see that.
Right. Well, I have to say I was skeptical too. When I first, how do I know if this is true or not? And then I started reading all your documentation, and I remembered that book I had read, and I thought, wow, we just don't know what we don't know.
Right.
We just don't know.
We don't know what we don't know. And I mean, I think this was, I'm not an expert on what might have happened since then. I mean, some people who saw the movie, I think after MK Ultra was shut down, the historical record, some other CIA directors were very cooperative and turning over everything, demanding that everything that is known be let out. I mean, they really wanted to clean house. I've met people who were in the CIA. They all. It's the very first book conference I went to, and I was going to share my book to a published author. He introduced himself as being a former member of the CIA. A former CIA agent. So I said, "Oh, okay. What's he going to? How is he going to react to this?" But as I started sharing my story, he began nodding his head. He knew all about it. He was very supportive of me doing it. I know a guy that's one of the heads of is in the Alumni Association, involved with that heavily, of the ex-CIA members. He's very supportive. So, but I think some of the things that came after that was the psychic stuff, the psychic spies, the remote viewing. The Men Who Stared Goats is a movie and a book that deals with that. Um, and I do want to just, we're going to talk about the healing maybe on another program, but,
Yes.
talk therapy was very useful, but I did benefit from a lot of innovative techniques when I moved out to California. They're, of course, available all over the country now. But I met the founder of EFT. My therapist knew him. Emotional freedom technique. That's based on tapping on energy meridian points on the body. So basically, you say, even though I have anxiety about doing a presentation, and I used to have lots of anxieties about presentations, it's gone, but I sure had it, and because it was tied to my MK Ultra experience. Although lots of people do have anxiety about that topic, but it's just very common. You tap before you do that presentation, and it can really calm you down. There was a lady that I worked with that was consumed with anger against certain individuals that she was going to meet the next day, and she was afraid she would lose it. So we tapped with her, actually a group of us tapped with her, and it completely went away. She was stunned. She expected it to return. When she met with those people, it did not return. Now, hers was a very simple issue. She was angry at one group of people. Many of my issues that I've had are multi-layered. I number of different experiences, both inside and outside of MK Ultra, caused them. So it takes time, but even then, it works. So my wife and I are going to be opening up a website dealing with EFT called communotapping.com, communotappingplus.com, in which it's about the power of tapping in groups. We sort of accidentally discovered it at our church. And that it's like group prayer. You may have heard of that. It's just, its power is enhanced. It's very powerful just doing it on yourself, or many therapists do it. And work with her, and certainly my therapist did. Other techniques are going to be on the website that are good, that people can consider, because I used them, and actually a very experienced therapist and I wrote these articles about hypnotherapy, gratitude, Reiki, you may have heard of that, energy techniques. As well as even past life regression or ancestral healing. Ancestral healing has become very big in tapping because they've pretty much proven now that trauma can be handed down through DNA expression. And you may think you had a perfect childhood, but you may have some trauma hanging over from your ancestors.
Right. Well, I think that will be another very interesting interview to have. So we'll have to schedule it for the future. Okay. When do you think you will have your that website up?
Yeah, it should be up hopefully within the next month to two. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, if you go to people who are interested in that, can go to my BillYarbo.com, and then when they go to other books and releases, the book that my wife and I are working on is highlighted there, and then there's a place you can put in your name, rather your email, so that you'll be notified when that website opens up if you're interested.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you very much for being here with me today, and I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did, and learned quite a bit there. I want to thank my audience for being here today, for joining us, and invite you back next Tuesday at noon. We'll be back same time, same place. And I hope that if you have a storm that you're going through right now, that you will be enabled to go through a healing and start talking about it, and get through it so you can go on to having a happy life again. And I'll see you next week. And thanks again, Bill, for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.